for Charlie Chaplin in Vaudeville Part 2. So by 1910, Carnot's speechless comedians had developed such a reputation that they got booked for American vaudeville. The institution of vaudeville had changed a great deal since Charles Chaplin Sr. had come over. By this time, several great regional and national circuits had emerged. And if you don't know, vaudeville was this huge industry, this big phenomenon where these big corporate chains would book acts all throughout the country, and the acts would travel from town to town, usually by train, to get to these engagements. It was kind of an arduous lifestyle. If you were doing well in the big time, you might play 2 shows a day. And the lower small-time theaters, you do several shows a day, and it was more of a grind. You'd be held over in one location if you were doing well, and you'd play what was called a split week or single night stands if you weren't doing so well and you were at the bottom of the ladder. Anyway, vaudeville at this stage, around 1910, was midway to the monopoly industry. It would come close to attaining by towards the end of existence in the mid-30s. I'm sure you know the name Keith Orpheum. Keith was the East Coast big time, and Orpheum was the West Coast big time. But there were a number of other circuits still at this time, some of them quite important. And for whatever reason, either ignorance or a better deal or just plain not getting booked by Keith, Carnot booked his troupe with opposition circuits. In New York, the first leg was with the Percy Williams Theater. At this time, Williams was the more important vaudeville manager in New York, more important than Keith, which might have been why Carnot booked with him instead. But by doing so, it also meant that he couldn't play the Keith Orpheum houses when they left New York. So he had to go with cheesier substitute, which we'll get to. Ironically, Percy Williams sold his entire circuit to Keith just 2 years later, which would have made the entire issue moot if they booked it at that time. Percy Williams had started out with medicine shows. Then he started a Coney Island-style resort at Bergen Beach in Brooklyn, and then began buying theaters in Manhattan, such as the Colonial Theater. Colonial was notorious for being located near Hell's Kitchen, up by Columbus Circle. It was famously known for its rowdy working-class audiences who did something called the Colonial Clap, this slow, menacing clap they would do to get what they wanted from the performers. Alice Lloyd, Marie Lloyd's sister from Music Hall, had come over to New York and played at that theater. Percy Williams also owned the Alhambra, which was in Harlem. That's a place where the Tramp comedian Nat M. Wills performed. We're going to return to him in a little bit. Another act that played the Williams circuit was the Four Mortons, which were a sort of cross between the Four Cohans and the Three Keatons, a kind of family act that did Irish knockabout, like a mother, father, son, and daughter, and they would just hit each other, have fights. So expectations were high because Carnot's comedians were the headliners on this bill of this excellent circuit. You probably know that the billing was very important in vaudeville. To be the headliner was to be the top, most famous act. Usually an acrobatic act of the sort that Carnot's was would be like the opener, because it's, for the large portion, those kind of acts would be unspeaking, so people could come and settle down and talk a little bit while they were still performing. Usually acrobatic acts would not have stars or be famous, but Carnot's company had such a reputation that they were billed as the headliners. They had a company of about 15. They were on the same bill with Gus Edwards' School Days Act, which is a famous act, and they were billed over Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards was a kiddie act. A lot of really famous performers came up through this schoolroom sketch that he did and became famous. It was almost like a school for vaudevillians. So Chaplin mentions Walter Winchell, who was just a boy, being there. I know that Eddie Cantor was in the Gus Edwards troupe at around the same time. People like Lillian Roth or Eleanor Powell started out with the Gus Edwards act. Carnot had this repertoire of funny sketches. They're no longer speechless. Chaplin quotes some of the dialogue, some of the corny dialogue from these sketches. They started out doing something called the Wow Wows, very ill-advised decision of Carnot's. It was about secret societies, and that was very popular in the U.S. at the time. This is the age of Babbitt and Main Street and so forth. And so Carnot assumed that that would be surefire satire or something. But it kind of tanked, and it was mortifying and painful. And so it didn't translate somehow. They had a couple of painful weeks, and then finally they played the Fifth Avenue Theater, which was an F.F. Proctor house. And when they played that, all of a sudden they got all of these laughs. And it turns out that the Fifth Avenue Theater was patronized by all the English butlers and maids during the matinee, so they understood the humor. So even so, Chaplin got good reviews in Variety, like standalone reviews for his own work, even though the company itself was kind of panned. At this time, he writes of, this is in his autobiography, writes that he was conferring with another act on the bill, a trapeze artist who was also a boxer, and they would spar in their off time. And they began hatching a plan to have a hog farm. And this is almost proverbial among vaudevillians, is that they were going to retire and have farms. Even the Marx Brothers had a farm for a while, by the way. So that's a pretty funny movie in and of itself. So yeah, he was seriously considering having a hog farm, and so he's already working on his post-vaudeville parachute, and he's in his early 20s. That's how discouraging it could be at times, but obviously he did not do that. So at a certain point in the run, they ditched the Wow Wows and replaced it with a surefire sketch called Mumming Birds, which they quickly renamed for American audiences A Night in the English Music Hall. Probably everybody who's watching this knows that sketch. Chaplin largely recreated it in his S&A comedy, A Night in the Show, which kind of de-emphasized a lot of the core material except for his own bit, which was the starring role, in which he plays this drunk who comes in and causes a commotion in the audience during this variety show. And A Night in the English in an English Music Hall was this sketch within a sketch, or vaudeville within a vaudeville, and they would make use of the actual audience and a show up on the stage. Chaplin, you can actually see his version, his later film version of his performance in A Night in the Show. Also, very interestingly, to me personally, there's not a lot of film of actual vaudeville shows back in the day. But in this movie, you can see Chaplin's recreation of one, which is more sideshow-like than most vaudeville bills of the time. It's a little skewed towards sideshow because there's a belly dancer, a snake charmer, and a fire eater, in addition to an opera singer, probably because those are more colorful, jokey kind of things. But it's very worthwhile to watch. There's something we'll touch on that relates back to the acts that we see in A Night in the Show. So after New York, they embarked on a 20-week tour of the Midwest, starting from Chicago, working their way all the way to the coast on the Sullivan and Considine circuit. That was a 3-a-day grind, small time. In Percy Williams theaters in New York, you had polished brass railings and red velvet curtains and carpets. Sullivan and Considine is small time. John W. Considine had started out with a box house in Seattle. That's a combination variety theater, saloon, and house of prostitution. He was backed in the venture of starting this circuit by Big Tim Sullivan, who was a Tammany Hall politician based in the Bowery, who probably got a lot of his ideas from Henry Miner, who Miner's Bowery Theater was the place where they invented the hook that yanked you off stage if you wouldn't stop performing and the audience didn't like you. So this is a rowdy kind of theater. It's not the posh, proper Percy Williams kind of thing. Considine had booked Little Egypt from the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. So that's one point of connection, I think, between the night and the show. There is a belly dancer in that show. That's kind of makes me think that's the Sullivan and Considine aesthetic. Unlike Percy Williams theaters or the Orpheum theaters out west, Sullivan and Considine theaters did not book stars. Al Jolson had played the circuit, but several years before he became famous. But I found this ad, circa 1910, from a Sullivan and Considine theater in Los Angeles called the Los Angeles Theater. Probably a flagship venue for the circuit, but some great details here. It promises another great bill, chock full of painless laughs. And these are the acts. Anne Blanche and Company offering Robert Hilliard's slangy sketch Freckles. The Velde Trio, European gymnasts and their loop-de-loop dogs. Ray Nevermind Snow, that bright monologist. I guess Nevermind is probably his catchphrase. Newell and Niblo, they get music out of anything. Maddie Lockett, the clever little comedienne in as the original Mary Jane. The Shaws, Wonders of the Billiard World, and something called the Laughoscope, which I'm guessing was not very famous comedy movies. If they were famous, we'd probably get more ID to them than just the Laughoscope, which is just the machine they show it on. So the Carnot troupe did 20 weeks on Sullivan and Considine. Those are the kind of acts that were probably on the bill with them at that time. They were about to head home to London. Then in New York, William Morris, founder of the famous eponymous circuit, booked them for his American Music Hall, which was another big opposition house in New York. This is back to the big time. It was located across 8th Avenue from where the Port Authority is right now. Great location for a theater. Right now it's a parking lot, I think. So anyway, this is Keith Opposition House, and very famous performers played there, including major music hall acts like Gus Ellen. R.A. Roberts, who was a quick change artist, did all the characters, and Dickens would play 6 characters in a sketch, including a couple of women. Sir Harry Lauder, probably the biggest, either in music hall or vaudeville. He was one of the biggest acts, the Scottish singer. One of the, such was Harry Lauder's success that it could make or break a theater. Broke all kinds of attendance records. Young Sophie Tucker, before she was famous, performed there. Grace LaRue and her Inky Dinks. You can imagine what the Inky Dinks were. It's not politically correct. We won't go down that road today. The most famous chimpanzee act, Consul the Great, performed at the American Music Hall. So Carnot's comedians fit right in. They've been playing a night in the English Music Hall for just month after month, so it's really sharp and funny now. They got great New York notices. So they went out on tour again, played another 20 weeks of Sullivan and Considine, then came home, went back to London in 1912, then came back to the U.S. for yet another tour, and on this leg of the tour, 2 very momentous things happened. One is just a bit of legendary but true magic. Sullivan and Considine were in constant competition with another circuit in the Pacific Northwest called the Pantages Circuit, which you may have heard of. And long about 1912, there was another madcap, crazy comedy team touring the Pantages Circuit, and they happened to be in the same city at the same time as the Carnot's troupe was in the same town. So these guys, this other comedy team, went to see Chaplin and came back, were so impressed with what they saw, they went back to the dressing room and had to go congratulate Charlie, talk to him. They're both small-time acts, not yet famous, but they knew what they liked. And this other act that was touring the Pantages Circus was the Marx Brothers. This is pre-Zeppo. This is the Gummo days. But Groucho spoke of Charlie, being the funniest performer he ever saw. And it's on the strength of that drunk act from A Night in the English Music Hall. So that happened. But then a little bit later, when they were playing Philly, that was where and when Chaplin got the telegram from Kessel and Bauman to look them up. And so he was booked for Keystone and the movies. Around the same time, Stan Laurel, who was Chaplin's understudy and roommate, also abandoned the troupe for the movies. The writing is on the wall for Carnot eventually. But from his variety days, this is why when you look at those silent movies, he has all of these skills, right? Even in the talkies, he sings a little. He sings in modern times. But you can clearly dance, do pantomime, slapstick, mimicry, play the violin extremely well, and drag, all of which graced his movies and he got from variety. Also, something else, his character came from variety. Tramp comedians were an entire subcategory of vaudeville specialty back in the day. So though Chaplin invested his character with his own genius, the trappings themselves of the costume and so forth were pretty familiar to audiences at that time. In fact, Carnot colleague Billy Ritchie, who originated the drunk bit in A Night in the Music Hall, always insisted that Chaplin had plagiarized it from him. But it doesn't really count if the guy who plagiarized your costume and stuff is better than you are. So, but Music Hall was full of Tramp singers. Circuses were full of Tramp clowns. W.C. Fields was a Tramp juggler. Nat M. Wills was a Tramp monologist. And I've not yet come across Chaplin seeing Nat M. Wills, but there's a little bit of comparison there, because Nat Wills was a talking comedian like Will Rogers or whatever. He wore this very pathetic sort of hobo makeup, but then he would talk in a sort of posh and affected way, which reminds me a little of Chaplin. Chaplin puts on airs often. He gets a lot of humor by doing things that seem like has manners and a way of doing things that's contrary to being a hobo. I think some of that there's some possible comic overlap between Nat Wills and Chaplin. Anyway, that Tramp thing goes, as I'm sure you know, well into the 20th century, and performers like Red Skelton, who did that on his TV show. Vaudeville died right around the time of Chaplin's City Lights, a little bit after that. Later, he paid it homage famously in his movie Limelight in 1952, where those magical scenes with Buster Keaton. One bit that he does in that little sort of flea circus routine, which he also did in The Professor, which I believe you're screening in this festival, probably has its origins back in Charlie's own music hall days as well. His last homage to variety theater in his early days can be seen, I believe, in A King in New York in 1957. There's that kind of strange nightclub scene where he goes, and there are these clowns. One of the clowns is Laurie Lupino Lane of the famous Lupino family we talked about, and the other is George Truzzi, and they're doing this kind of slapstick sketch with ladders and stuff and paint. That's the sort of stuff that had happened in Carnot and probably wasn't happening in any nightclubs in 1957. So I think Charlie was getting a little bit untethered from reality by that late part in his career. Before I go, I want to do this plug for my books. No Applause, Just Throw Money, the book that made vaudeville famous, my first book, and the second, Chain of Fools, Silent Comedy and Its Legacies, from Nickelodeons to YouTube. If you're curious, I hope you buy them and learn more. Bye-bye and bye bonds.